Well, it is a pleasure for me to be here in Geneva, and it was quite exciting for me to walk into this building and see that I would be speaking in the Jean Piaget auditorium. The story that you just heard about his false memory is a very famous story in the false memory world. One of the things that was left out of the story is the nurse who told the story of having rescued little Piaget from the attempted kidnapping was given a watch as a reward by the family. And I have since been trying to find out what happened to that watch, because I think it must be worth a tremendous amount of money now. And it was not in the watch museum in Neuchâtel when I went there to look. I like to notice, as a scientist who studies memory, I see memory problems everywhere. And I kind of collect them. And one last year was a wonderful memory distortion story that just fell into my lap when Hillary Clinton, who was running for the presidency of the United States, she now, of course, is our Secretary of State, she was campaigning for the presidency, and she told a story about a trip that she had taken to Bosnia. She said she had a very detailed memory of this trip. She said, "I remember landing under sniper fire. There was supposed to be some kind of greeting ceremony at the airport, but instead we just ran with our heads down to get into the vehicles to get to our base." Well, when Hillary Clinton was telling this story, which she told a couple of times about this traumatic landing in Bosnia, she either forgot or didn't realize that, or didn't remember that there were a lot of other people present, and in fact, the greeting ceremony was filmed. The actual trip to Bosnia looked very different than her memory. It occurred in 1996. And you can see that there she is. She's with her daughter. She's being greeted, their children. It was a very peaceful greeting ceremony. So what is going on with Hillary Clinton trying to tell the public that she had this traumatic landing in Bosnia? Is she lying? Or is there some other explanation? We had some journalists who decided that she was lying. In fact, one of them gave her 4 Pinocchios. There was no corkscrew landing. There was no sniper fire. There was no canceled airport reception. And she was not the first lady to go into a war zone. Well, Hillary did come up with an explanation because she was confronted with the evidence that things weren't right. And here's what she said: "I made a mistake. I had a different memory. I made a mistake. That happens. That proves I'm human," which for some people is a revelation. Well, I like this example because it shows you that all that intelligence, all that education, trained at Yale Law School, all that experience doesn't protect you from having false memories. I do tend to look at legal cases as a way of applying the scientific work that I do. And there are a couple of categories of cases that have captured my attention and the attention of many other cognitive scientists. And so, for example, one class of cases concerns a kind of a typical crime, sometimes a murder, sometimes a rape, a serious crime, where somebody has been convicted and sentenced to prison, and now, years later, sometimes after 5 years of prison, 10 years of prison, 15 or 20, new DNA testing has revealed that these people are actually innocent. And you can go to the website of the Innocence Project, and you can find out a lot about these cases. There are now several hundred documented cases of actual innocence, people for whom DNA has shown that they didn't commit these crimes. And when those cases have been analyzed, which of course people want to do, what went wrong, exactly what went wrong, and what can we do to prevent these tragedies in the future, the major cause of these wrongful convictions is faulty human memory. So you add up all the other reasons why someone might be in prison for a crime they didn't do, even a false confession, prosecution misconduct, circumstantial evidence that just happened to lead a trier of fact to convict the wrong person. All of these don't add up in terms of the numbers to the importance of faulty human memory as a cause of these wrongful convictions. But there's another kind of a case that I've been involved in, and this is what has led to a lot of the controversy that was alluded to in the introduction. These are cases that involve accusations of repressed memory. A very good example of such a case, the kind of case that I'm talking about, is illustrated here with the Ramona family. It became a famous case in North America, and so that's why the Ramona family appeared on the cover of Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine. The problem started for Gary Ramona, the father, who was a winery executive. He was making hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. He had an important job with one of our top wineries in California. He lived in a beautiful house. He had what he thought was a fabulous family, and his world came crashing down when his daughter, Holly, went into therapy. She was 18 years old, and there she discovered, after certain procedures were used on her, there she discovered that she had been raped for more than a decade, between the ages of 5 and 16, allegedly raped by her father, allegedly forced into sex with the family dog numerous times. She was completely unaware of these experiences until the psychotherapy taught her that this had happened to her. She sued her father in a civil court case. And then what made this case so famous is the father turned around and he sued the therapist for planting false memories in the mind of his daughter. He won $500,000 from a jury in Napa, California. And so when I see these cases involving sometimes these very bizarre memory stories that are being entered into court cases and are leading to such tragedies, I think it really makes the point that the subject of memory and memory distortion has important implications. So I want to tell you a little bit about the work that I and other scientists in this field do in order to study false memories. And basically we use a couple of different paradigms. And so one of the paradigms is called the misinformation paradigm. What happens here is we show people an event. It might be a simulated crime or a simulated accident or some sort of material we can present to people. Afterwards, we expose people to some post-event information. That's the PEI. And then we test people for their memory for the event itself. And this is a very common paradigm for studying memory and memory distortion. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the newer work being done with a slightly different paradigm. This paradigm sometimes goes by the name rich false memories. And what happens here, and I'll explain where this idea came from, is there is no event that occurred in the past, but you ply people with certain suggestions about their past, you feed them suggestive information, And then you test them, you ask them questions about their childhood or their more recent past. And so these two paradigms are meant to kind of map onto the two kinds of legal situations that I described earlier. So I'll show you an example of what an event that might be presented to subjects in this kind of scientific work on misinformation. We might show subjects an event that unfolds, perhaps in a series of slides. It might even be 50 slides. They tell a story. And so here are just a few of the slides in one of the stories that we've used, where a woman is walking down the street. She goes into an apartment building. More things happen to her. In the middle of the series, a man comes along. He bumps into her, causes her to drop her bag. He leans over, apparently trying to help her pick up her stuff. And while he's at it, he reaches into her purse, pulls out her wallet, and puts it into his jacket pocket. The stories continue. The woman has more interactions, and eventually she notices that her wallet is missing, and she starts to look harder for it, and eventually questions people around her about what they might have seen. So that's an example of an event. So we know what the truth is, and now we can expose people to some new information about the event, the kind of situation that happens when people talk to other witnesses, or when they get interrogated about an event, or when they see news coverage about an event that they might have witnessed. New information comes along. In these experiments, it might involve just listening to a narrative about the event that happened, and you're going to see some misinformation in a minute when the narrative starts to tell that the man, the thief, reached into the purse, pulled out the wallet, and put it in his pants pocket, not the jacket pocket. And then the narrative continues. And so you can see here an example of post-event information that is misleading, where the actual scene showed a man put the wallet in a jacket pocket. Let's see if I can go back. The narrative talks about the pants pocket, and then people can be tested on their memory for what happened. This follows some older work that psychologists in this room might recognize, where we showed people simulated accidents. In one example, a car goes through a stop sign at an intersection without stopping, and just by asking a simple leading question, like, did another car pass the red dots, and while it was at the intersection with the yield sign, we can make many people believe and remember that they saw a yield sign at that intersection, not a stop sign. So what I'd like to do is tell you a little bit about some brand new work that we're just now trying to get published. The collaborators in this work are a former graduate student, Maya Cook, Don Hoffman, who is a colleague of mine at the University of California, Irvine. And what I would like to do here, just so you can see what it's like to be a subject in one of these experiments, is I'd like to do a little demonstration with you. And so please follow my instructions and just go with your gut feeling. Don't think too much. I'm going to show you a set of faces. These are your study faces, and you just pay attention to the faces, and I'll ask you some questions about them later. Now, in the experiment, with materials like this, we'd have more faces. Some time would pass. I don't have the luxury of time because I have a lot that I want to tell you about. And so now what might happen is there's a little quiz. And what I want you to do here for this quiz is I just want you to think quietly about what your answer would be. I don't want you to say anything to anybody around you or say anything out loud or in any way have you contaminate any people who might be sitting near you. And so your job really is, you can do this on paper if you want or just do it in your head. I'm going to show you two faces, and you tell me if you saw the one on the left or the one on the right. So here's your first test. Did you see the one on the left or the one on the right, you just think to yourself and don't say anything. Did you see the one on the left or the one on the right? Think to yourself, don't say anything. And now what I'd like to do is, ordinarily much more time would pass, just as the way it does in a real case when a real crime or accident or legally relevant event occurs. There is, obviously, you're not testing people a minute later. And here's the final test. I want to see if you can remember the study slides, the slides I showed you in the study phase. And now what I'm going to ask you to do is raise your hand with your answer so that we can look around and see what everybody else thinks. And so here's your first test item, your final test. Which face did you see in the study slides? How many people picked the one on the left? Okay, you can look around and you can see that there are lots of hands up. How many picked the one on the right? You can look around. There are a few weird people over there. But you can see there's quite a bit of agreement in this room. Now, the one on the left, raise your hand. Well, we have just a sprinkling of hands. The one on the right, raise your hand. Look around. Don't say anything out loud, but I think you can see that we have virtually this whole group, with a few exceptions, picking the one on the right. The next pair, the one on the left, raise your hand. The one on the right, raise your hand. Well, what's going on here? If you look around, half of you want the one on the left, half of you want the one on the right. How come you weren't so divided on the other trials and now you're divided on this one? Here's what happened. I made many of you identify the wrong person. How did I do that? I showed you a series of 3 slides, and so we have phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And for the final test, you were tested with pairs of faces, and you were supposed to identify the person who you saw initially in the study phase. So the correct answer for the first test is the one on the left. Most of you got that. The correct answer for the second pair is the one on the right. Most of you got that. The correct answer is the one on the right. Maybe half of you got that. How did I get the rest of you to pick the wrong face? It's because of what I did during the interval. During the interval, when I was giving you a quiz, for the first face, I gave you a quiz that contained the true guy and a completely novel one, and I'm sure that silently many of you had no trouble picking this true guy. For the second face, I didn't test you at all. But look what I did for the third face. You can see that I presented an altered version of phase 3. The internal features are totally different. He has similar hair, but the internal features are different. You saw an altered version of phase 3 alongside a totally novel face. Many of you then were induced to pick the altered face, and you stuck with it during the final test. And in our experiments with these materials, we can show that people will be led, many people, many healthy, ordinary human beings here at a major university can be led to pick the wrong person. And the problem is especially cute if I get you to commit to that wrong face, that similar face. If you commit to it, then it's often hopeless for you thereafter. I had a chance to demonstrate this phenomenon recently on a program in the United States called 60 Minutes. This program airs every Sunday night on television. It's a very popular program. And earlier this year, The program was all about a case of wrongful conviction involving a woman named Jennifer Thompson and a man named Ronald Cotton. Jennifer Thompson was raped. She was a college student when she was raped some time ago, and she would ultimately identify Ronald Cotton as the person who committed the rape. Ronald Cotton was convicted based on Jennifer's very compelling eyewitness testimony, and he was sent to prison for a very long time. Eventually, DNA testing revealed that he was actually innocent, and it further revealed that another man named Bobby Poole had been the one who actually committed the rape. What's interesting from the point of view of the demonstration that I did with you is that when Jennifer Thompson, after she had already committed to Ronald Cotton being her rapist, testified against him, sent him to prison for a very long time, she had a chance to see Bobby Poole. And she looked at him and she said, "No, it's not him," when somebody was suggesting that maybe this was another suspect. Her memory had become Ronald Cotton. What's unusual about this case, and I told you there are hundreds of them on the website of the Innocence Project, including the Cotton case. What's unusual about this case is that once he was freed, she apologized, he forgave her, they have become friends, and they've published this book called Picking Cotton that was just released this year about their experiences from their separate perspectives. And it's a very interesting book. I mean, imagine how she must have felt when the police came to her and told her about the DNA testing and that she had sent the wrong man to prison. So I had a chance during an interview to demonstrate with Leslie Stahl, the journalist for 60 Minutes, the same demonstration that I had done with you. And when I showed her the two faces during the final test, she looked at them for the longest time. She said, "I'm baffled." And then she went ahead and picked the wrong face. So I tell you that those of you who picked the wrong face after I seduced you into doing it, you're in good company with very prominent journalists from the United States. Now, you might think, okay, you know, these faces are a little bit artificial. And one very excellent question I got during a talk I gave this morning, I believe it was from a judge, was, you know, you've showed many faces in that experiment and tested on many faces, and that's very different from what happens out there in the real world, where a witness or a victim sees one perpetrator, maybe two or a few, and then has to make an identification. And maybe there's something kind of artificial about these faces. Maybe it wouldn't happen with real-life, natural stress. Well, I want to show you the results of some recent work that we are now just submitting for publication using a very unusual population of people. In the United States, we have a program, it's sometimes referred to as survival school, where some of our best soldiers are put through a very, very stressful, rigorous training program to train them for what it is going to be like if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. A psychiatrist named Andy Morgan heads up a research team using these survival school soldiers as subjects. He published his first paper on the survival school soldiers back in about 2004 or 2005. And it's very interesting work because they're very stressful experiences. So you can really look at people's ability to remember details about a kind of naturally stressful event. If you were a soldier going to this survival school, it's called SEER, for Survive, Evade, Resist, and Escape. The soldiers learn how to evade the enemy. They learn how to escape if they're hunted down. They learn how to try to resist if they're captured, imprisoned, and tortured. Eventually, they are captured, and they're taken to a mock prisoner of war camp. They are hooded, they're strapped together, they're stripped of their identities. They're put into these cells with, this is my nightmare, third world toilets with no toilet paper. And then they are extracted by helicopter, which is what's going to happen to them if the jungle is too dense to land in. And when it's over, there is a flood of emotions about after having survived this experience and being rescued from your ordeal. The stress levels are tremendous for the soldiers who are going through this experience. You can see cortisol levels here for the SEER or survival school experience compared to other kinds of experiences that are known to produce high levels of stress. I found a memoir recently that somebody had published that very poignantly described what his experience was like having gone through the survival school. He said he was slammed against the wall, which swayed as I leaned back on it. He slapped me with his open hand at least 6 times until stars appeared in my vision. I bit my gums. My mouth was quickly filling with blood. And then he also describes having endured the waterboard torture, which simulates drowning. He says he left the SEER school a few pounds lighter with a swollen mouth and an incredible fear of being captured by the enemy. So it is a very stressful experience. And I persuaded Andy Morgan, the psychiatrist who is conducting these studies, to introduce some misinformation into a survival school experiment. And I just want to tell you one little piece of our results. The study is, it's kind of complicated. It has many conditions and lots of subjects. But at least one condition that I want to tell you about is there is a 30-minute extremely stressful interrogation. And afterwards, some of the subjects are given some misinformation. And so what happens with these subjects who get the misinformation is an interrogator holds a photograph out like this and says, did your interrogator, during that 30 minutes of stressful, did he give you anything to eat? Did he give you a blanket? Did he let you speak to any other people? The thing is, the person in that photograph is not the real interrogator. The real interrogator or perpetrator who committed these stressful acts upon the subject might be the person on your left, but in the photograph, the subjects are exposed to the person on the right, and you can see they don't even look very similar to each other. At some later time, these soldiers are going to be asked to identify the person who committed the stressful interrogation upon them. And they look at these 9 photos. The real guy isn't there. We call that a target absent photo array. The real guy isn't there. But the foil, the one in the photograph for the misinformation subjects, is there. And you can see here what happens when soldiers have to try to identify who did that awful interrogation. If they do not get any misinformation, they go ahead and they make a false identification about half the time, 53% of the time. They're rarely picking the key foil that was misinformation for the other subjects. But look at these soldiers who were in the misinformation condition. They go ahead and pick somebody 91% of the time. They're all false identifications because the real guy isn't there, and virtually all of them are picking the photograph in the foil. And so I think you can see here, even with a very select group of people, these trained soldiers, you can feed them misinformation, you can make them make an erroneous identification by an act that is simply putting out a fake photograph and implying that that is the person who committed the awful interrogation. We will be publishing these results soon, and I do have this kind of awful feeling that, well, I believe that science needs to be out there, even if it can get into hands that will put it to some ill use. I do have to say I'm a little bit worried about how easy it is to steer people away from their memory of the true perpetrators by a technique that is as simple as this one. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the rich false memory paradigm, because this is where I've been spending a lot of my research effort. It was meant to kind of simulate a situation like the Ramona case, where we have very good reason to believe that there wasn't any 10 years of rapes and there wasn't any forced sex with the family dog, and yet through certain suggestive psychotherapy, the daughter was led to believe that these things occurred and even to conjure up details of these experiences. Could we find a way to simulate that sort of situation where we plant wholly false memories into the minds of people? Now, I want you to think about what a difficult idea this is. There you are, you're a scientist, you're working in a university, you would like to study these very rich, detailed false memories. You'd like to design an experiment in which you can do that so you can understand and learn something about the process. But you do have to worry about a few things. Like, there is a human subjects review committee. It reviews all proposed research involving human subjects to be sure that the research will not be harmful to the subjects who are participating. We don't, even in the name of science, want to hurt people. And so you need to come up with a paradigm that will be acceptable to this human subjects review committee. They're not going to let you try to bring in subjects and convince the subjects that their father made them have sex with the family dog. It's just not going to go over with these committees. So we need an analog. We need something that we could plant in the minds of people, something that would have been at least mildly traumatic if it actually had happened. And that was the genesis of our idea. Why don't we try to make people believe and remember that when they were a child, like 5 or 6 years old, they were lost in a shopping mall or other big public place if they grew up in a place that had big department stores but not shopping malls, that they were lost for an extended period of time in this particular location, that they were frightened, crying, ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. Well, how are we going to make people believe that? It turns out the way we did it was to enlist the help of their mothers and fathers. And so we would get information from the mothers and fathers or older relatives of our subjects, and we'd say, we've talked to your mother. We found out some things that happened to you when you were 5 or 6 years old. We want to ask you about these experiences and see what you can remember. And we would feed them some true memories and then the false story about being lost in the shopping mall for an extended time in a particular location at a particular age and ultimately being rescued and reunited with the family. We found about a quarter of our subjects fell for the suggestion and developed either a partial or a complete false memory. And after we published that study, there was a lot of criticism. I mean, some of the psychotherapists could see where we were going with this idea, that we were maybe suggesting that some of the activities out there being engaged in by some psychotherapists, social workers, investigators who were exploring and trying to investigate crimes were perhaps inadvertently contaminating people. And so one of the criticisms that we heard about the Lost in the Mall study is, look, getting lost is common. It happens all the time. Why don't you show us that you can plant a rich false memory for something that would be more unusual or bizarre if it had actually happened? And so other investigators came along, and they started to plant false memories using this same technique, the Lost in the Mall technique. We've talked to your parents. We found out what happened to you. And they planted memories of, for example, spilling punch, knocking accidentally into a punch bowl at a family wedding and spilling punch on the parents of the bride. In this particular work, A quarter of the subjects fell for the suggestion and started to develop a false memory of this accident at a family wedding. In some other excellent work from Canada, a doctoral dissertation by a psychologist named Stephen Porter managed to convince lots of people that they were a victim of an indoor accident or an outdoor accident or a vicious animal attack. Using this same technique, they suggested successfully to 26% who were convinced to have a complete false memory and an additional 30% who had a partial false memory for something that would have been pretty traumatic if it actually had happened. And so these are a few examples of where we have used some strong suggestion to lead people to have false beliefs and false memories and to come up with very rich, detailed stories about these made-up experiences. But you don't even need that really strong suggestion. You can get this kind of reaction from people by taking them through guided imagination or dream interpretation. You know, let me just say something about dream interpretation for a minute. If you have ever done therapy or been in therapy, you might appreciate that sometimes people talk about their dreams. And there's nothing wrong with doing this as long as you realize that day residue, what you're worried about during the day, can make its way into dream material at night. The problem comes in when the psychotherapist takes the dream material and tells the patient, you know, when you dream about that topic, that means you were sexually abused. So I have been involved in court cases where she dreamt about a snake and the therapist said that's a penis. In another case, she dreamt about a serpent. The therapist said that's a penis. I had one case that I testified in the state of Washington, where I used to teach, where the patient dreamt about a cinnamon roll, and the therapist said that was a penis. And it took a while to try to figure out what was going on in the mind of this therapist that she thought that was a penis. And that is why we have cross-examination, because it was through the cross-examination that we learned that in the mind of the therapist, the reason for that suggestion was the goo on the cinnamon roll. The goo. I don't know how to say goo in French, but yeah. And I am sure you're never going to look at cinnamon rolls in quite the same way after this talk. But dream interpretation can lead people to false memories. We've shown that in a series of studies. Hypnosis, where you put people in a highly suggestible state, they're even more prone to accepting suggestions and leading to false memories. Exposing people to other people's stories, exposing them to doctored photographs, or exposing them to false information. I love this study of doctored photographs because it was done by one of my former postdocs and her current graduate students and collaborators. And what they did in this particular study is, it's kind of a variation on Lost in the Mall. They took a photograph of the subject when the subject was 5 or 6 years old. Here he is with his father. So that's an old photograph. The subject is now grown up. And what they did is Photoshop this into a hot air balloon ride. And now they presented this doctored photograph to the subjects along with some real photographs from the family scrapbook. And after exposure to the doctored photograph, half of these subjects started to remember going up in a hot air balloon ride. We've been criticized, all of us who do this work. What people like to say is, well, you know, how do we know that maybe the events, maybe they really happened? Maybe the subject really was lost in a shopping mall and the parents forgot about it. Maybe they were really bitten by a vicious dog. Maybe they really did have an indoor accident or had a spilled punch at some event in their childhood. And that has led me and others to try to say, okay, what we're going to have to do is try to plant memories for things that would be either implausible or even impossible. And that is the genesis of a study led by one of my doctoral students. We just published this year, Sherry Berkowitz, in which we convinced people that on a childhood trip to Disney, they had their ear uncomfortably, disturbingly, and distressingly licked by the Pluto character. Well, the critics say, maybe it really happened. Well, there are pedophiles that work at Disney, and so they find some way to kind of salvage the finding. And so we needed to try to plant memories for things that were impossible, that couldn't have happened, in order to convince our critics that we really were dealing with false memories. That's the genesis for the idea of trying to get people to believe and remember that on a childhood trip they met Bugs Bunny. Now, this is impossible because Bugs Bunny is a Warner Brothers character and would not be found at a Disney resort. And yet, after exposing people to this fake advertisement for Disney, where you see Bugs Bunny, there's the castle, it's all about this great trip to Disney. Our subjects just have to evaluate the ad. Do you like the colors, the layout, and so on? Later on, we ask people to tell us about a childhood trip to Disney and which characters they remember meeting. And we find that we can get many people, after a single exposure, but especially after multiple exposures to doctored ads that show Bugs Bunny at Disney, lots of people will say they met him. And they'll even give you details about the encounter. They touched his ear, they touched his tail, they heard him say, "What's up, Doc?" One said he was holding a carrot. All this sensory detail. Why is that important? That is important because we use sensory detail as a clue that we're dealing with a real memory. And when we listen to the stories of others, which we do when we're a police officer listening to witnesses tell what happened, a psychotherapist listening to a patient talk about childhood, or even a friend listening to another friend tell about an experience, we use sensory detail as a clue that we're hearing an authentic story. And this work shows that even false memories can have lots of sensory detail. In my most recent line of work that I want to tell you about, and maybe the little bit of time I have left, we've become interested in the consequences of having a false memory. I believe, of course, that when false memories are planted, as they were in the Ramona case, they do have repercussions. People act on them. In the case of Holly Ramona, she went ahead and sued her father in civil court for these alleged crimes. But we wanted to try to demonstrate in an experimental setting that false memories can have repercussions. They can affect later thoughts, later intentions, later behavior. We devised a way to study this by planting false memories that when, as a child, you got sick eating particular foods. Because we reasoned that if we could get you to believe you got sick as a child eating particular foods, like hard-boiled eggs or dill pickles, maybe later on we would see that you would want to avoid these foods, and we would thereby be demonstrating a consequence of having a false memory. And so in this work, we get lots and lots of information from people about their childhood, about their interest in food, about their personality, and so on. They come back to the lab a week later, and we give them the manipulation. We tell them that we fed your data into our really smart computer program, and we learned that certain things almost certainly happened to you as a child. We hand them a profile that is apparently specialized for them. So here's one for Johnny Jones, who's told that certain things happened to you as a child, these 4 things, according to our analysis of your data. The critical item is in the 3rd position. You felt sick after eating a hard-boiled egg. It is embedded in other items that we think are true of many children, young children. And people have to think about this experience and try to remember these experiences. We try to get them to dwell on especially the getting sick aspects of this case. Then we ask people to imagine they're at a party. It's an afternoon. There are 100 people. They've gone for a swim. Now they're hungry. They go over to a table. There's all kinds of food choices on the table. How likely are you to eat each of these different foods? Embedded in this long list, much longer than what I'm showing you here, are the critical items: dill, pickle, spears, salted hard-boiled eggs. And people just tell us they definitely do want to eat it. You say yes, or they definitely don't want to eat it. That little yes is in the wrong position. Or give it an 8 if you definitely do want to eat it. Here's what happened. Here's how much people want to eat dill pickles or hard-boiled eggs if they don't get any false feedback at all. Here's how much they want to eat the foods if they were exposed to our suggestive manipulation, but they didn't buy into it. They did not develop a false memory. Here's how much they want to eat the foods if they were exposed to our manipulation and they fell for it. They don't want to eat these foods as much. And I can tell you, one of the great moments in the life of a scientist is when the graduate students come in and bring you the graphs and start showing you what the data are looking like. And I looked at these data and I thought, this is fantastic. This manipulation is getting people to tell us they don't want to eat those foods as much. If we could get this to work for a fattening food, we could be on the brink of a new dieting technique. Now, I was not planning to get into the eating business, but this was too irresistible. After we'd shown we could plant the false memory of the not very fattening food, let's see if it would work with a fattening food. We did the analogous study, the same method. We gathered a whole bunch of data from subjects. A week later, they come to the lab. They get the suggestive manipulation. We've entered all your data into the really smart computer. It's revealed certain things happened to you as a child, almost certainly. The critical item, italicized for you, but of course not for our subjects. You felt ill after eating strawberry ice cream. We then get them to try to think about the experience. If they can't remember it, try to imagine how it might have happened. They answer questions like, where would it have happened and how would you have felt, and so on. Let me show you just a little bit of the data. Here's how much people want to eat strawberry ice cream in one condition without any false feedback. Here's how much they want to eat it if they were exposed to the manipulation and didn't buy into it. Here's how much they want to eat it if they were exposed to the manipulation and they fell for it. They don't want to eat the food as much. This result, once we published it in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, went all over the world. It really, maybe because it was a fattening food, but people really paid attention to this. In Time magazine, our weekly news magazine, they devoted a whole page to the new mental diet. And I was very pleased that they did an interview. This doesn't always happen. And they published the caveats, which I must express here too. We don't know how long these effects are going to last. The New York Times magazine, which is published with the newspaper every Sunday, at the end of the year published the 78 most innovative scientific ideas of the year. And I was very, very pleased that there was the false memory diet. That was a big joy for us in the lab. And they, too, published the caveats. We don't know how long the effects will last, and we don't know whether these effects, whether the manipulation is going to be strong enough that it will enable a person to withstand resisting strawberry ice cream if you put it right in front of them. Remember, we had asked people to imagine they were at a party, and in this case, now, we don't know, or we didn't know back then, whether or not if they had the food in front of them, they still would resist it. We didn't know then, but we do know now. In some work published just last year in Psychological Science with my collaborators, Elke Gerhards, Dan Bernstein, our Dutch collaborator, Harold Merkelbach. I tried to find a photograph of Harold on the web. All you can find of Harold is a small photograph of Harold in his big car. I guess that's what he wants you to see. But he's a very fine scientist at Maastricht University. The study is very similar. We get data from people, all kinds of data. just to give our manipulation some credibility. The study was actually conducted in the Netherlands. A week later, they get the false feedback. You got sick eating egg salad. And then at the end of the session, they have a chance to eat various sandwiches and snacks and so on. How many egg salad sandwiches do they actually eat after the manipulation? And these subjects then, many of them were brought back to the lab 4 months later, a completely unrelated study to look and see when they have an opportunity to eat, what will they eat? How many egg salad sandwiches will they eat? It turns out it was pretty easy to get people to become confident after the manipulation. The manipulation occurred then between session 1 and 2. To become confident that they had this experience getting sick eating egg salad. 4 months later, they were still fairly confident, even though the confidence had dropped off. How many sandwiches did they eat? Here's how many egg salad sandwiches on the average were eaten by these subjects in session 2 immediately after the manipulation, and then 4 months later without any false feedback. Here's how many egg salad sandwiches people ate if they were exposed to the manipulation and didn't buy into it. Immediately afterwards, they weren't eating very many egg salad sandwiches, but by 4 months later, they were back to eating. And here's how many egg salad sandwiches they ate immediately after if they fell for the manipulation and developed a false memory. So it does affect actual eating behavior, and these effects last for quite a while. Simultaneously, another research group, and also publishing in the same year, did a very similar study with peach yogurt. It was this group did a very elegant study where they actually weighed the yogurt containers to see how much yogurt was missing after the manipulation. And they too showed that people could be led to believe they got sick eating peach yogurt as a child, and they didn't eat as much peach yogurt when given an opportunity to eat it 1 week later. Well, it was natural for us at this point, if we could plant a false negative memory that you got sick, and we could get people to avoid foods, could we do the opposite? Could we plant a positive, warm, fuzzy memory with a healthy food, for example, and make people want to eat it more? And this is what our research group attempted to do with asparagus. We planted a warm, fuzzy memory that when you were a child, you absolutely loved asparagus the first time you tried it. Then we asked people to imagine they're at a restaurant. It's a fancy restaurant. It's a special occasion. Price is no object. How likely are you to order each of the following foods, including sauteed asparagus spears? And we found that we could create this kind of false memory, that those who fell for it embraced the healthy food more. They said they wanted to eat asparagus. They also were more willing to pay more money for a pound of asparagus. So the economists who might be here, I want you to realize there's something in this for you too. And it does look like what we are doing, because we're trying to get at the mechanisms, is we're making even the sight or the thought of asparagus seem more appetizing and appealing. I have been dying to do a case study after we published our results. I thought if only I could get my hands on this subject. So far I haven't been able to do that. Maybe the former president of Switzerland, who is here tonight, can help me out. She might be the closest I can think of who might have access to a former president. This former president of the United States is well known for having said, I do not like broccoli. I wonder if your president ever said anything like this. What he fully said was, I do not like broccoli. I haven't liked it since I was a little kid and my mother made me eat it. I'm president of the United States. I'm not going to eat any more broccoli. Well, we believe if we could just get our hands on the former president and ply him with our suggestive manipulation, it would be just a matter of time before he was devouring broccoli and saying it was one of his very favorite veggies. And so I have shown you in this recent work that we can make people believe they got sick on dill pickles and we decrease their preference, that we can make people believe they got sick on strawberry ice cream and we can decrease their preference. We can make them believe they got sick on egg salad and it affects their actual eating behavior. We can do the opposite, make people believe they had a warm, fuzzy experience with a healthy food and increase their preference and their ordering of that food. And now we're beginning to ask whether the same sorts of things might work with other sorts of substances that we might like people in our society to either avoid or approach. In some recent work that we're just now writing up for publication, we do a similar kind of study with rum and vodka, where we get data from people, give them false feedback that as a kid you got, somewhere as a teenager or something, you got sick on this particular substance. Same kind of manipulation. It's either rum or vodka. And I'll show you some data from the vodka group. Here's how much people before the manipulation and after say they want to order a vodka drink. And here's how much they want to order it for the group before and after it reduced their ordering of this particular drink. So we're following up this kind of work to see just what other kinds of substances and experiences we can influence with our false memory manipulations. I'm running out of time. I was going to tell you a little bit about true versus false memories. I was going to tell you a little bit about people who have false memories of alien abductions, some excellent work being done at Harvard University where these people who have false memories of being abducted by aliens have a lot of emotional reaction to the false memories. I was going to tell you about a work of my doctoral student, Carol Laney, who planted false memories for things like you witnessed your parents having a physical fight and compared the false memory people to people who had a real, true memory for such experiences. And when she compared false and true memories, they were equivalent in terms of the emotional expression and emotionality of the memories. So these false memories can not only be detailed, and you can be confident about them, but this newer work shows that you can even be emotional about them. In fact, the false memories can be just as emotional for people as true memories. So emotion, as impressive as it might be to look at it, it's no guarantee of memory accuracy. I would have told you a little bit about some neuroimaging work that essentially, when you try to look at neural signals using fMRI, comparing true memories to false memories, the neural signals are very similar for true and false memories. And so now I want to just wrap up and say that we do believe that our work has important theoretical implications for the nature of memory. We think we're on the brink of really developing a recipe for how people end up with false memories. You first make people believe that what you're suggesting is a plausible event, and we can make things that previously were implausible seem plausible. Then you create a belief in the person that this event actually happened to them, and then you engage them in processes that add sensory detail to the bones of belief, and you are on your way to having a very rich false memory. But the practical implications of this work, for nutritional selection, I never even thought I would be heading in the direction of trying to solve the obesity problem in our society, but there may be something there. There may be a germ of an idea there that can be put to some societal good. And of course, these results have a number of implications for our legal system and for how witnesses and individuals who testify in court cases ought to be handled. And so I'll end the way I began, with Hillary's memory. I landed under sniper fire, she said, when the truth was very different. There are at least two explanations that have been proposed for what went on with Hillary Clinton. Either it's the Pinocchio explanation, it was a deliberate lie. I think that's fairly unlikely. I would go with Hillary's explanation. I made a mistake, I had a different memory. And again, it shows you if it can happen to someone so intelligent, experienced, and educated, it can happen to any of us. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup à Elisabeth Loftus de cet exposé si riche et vivant. On a un peu de temps pour poser des questions. Il y a des micros qui vont se promener dans la salle. On a un peu de peine à voir ce qui se passe dans la salle. Vous pourrez aussi poser des questions parce qu'il y a une traduction qui va venir. Donc vos questions peuvent être traduites si vous voulez les poser en français. Les micros sont partis là.
C'était...
Uh-oh.
Merci avant tout. Et c'était une précision à propos de Hillary Clinton. Je ne comprends pas très bien, Madame la professeure, pourquoi vous mettez sur le même plan les souvenirs extorqués, disons, chez un thérapeute à propos d'un inceste, et que ce soit sur le même plan ces mensonges quotidiens qu'on a pour bluffer, par exemple. Première question. Et la deuxième, est-ce que vos recherches vont modifier l'utilisation des détecteurs de mensonges?
Well, the part of the question about lie detectors, I'll just answer. There is some controversy about the use of lie detectors. When people are deliberately lying, allegedly it leads to a stress reaction that is sometimes detectable through these measurements that lie detectors purport to measure. But in the kinds of situations that I'm studying, and I believe it's true of the Hillary Clinton example, I believe it's true of the Ramona example, I believe it's true of many of my experimental subjects. These are people who truly believe in what they're now saying. And so you're not going to be able to give them any kind of lie detector test that is going to allow you to distinguish a false memory from an authentic one. It may be down the road we'll develop some other ways of doing that, of combining information that we get from people, combining information like what their eye movements look like, or how quickly they respond to certain stimuli, or how they say things, that we will be able to combine together to guide us in our thinking about whether we're dealing with a true memory or a false one. But at this point, we're not there yet.
What about the first question?
I didn't understand it, so.
The first question was to ask whether you would put at the same, that's always the same question,
Oh.
why you would place on the same plane such stupid lies, everyday lies, and emotional problems like incest and so on.
Okay. Well, I don't know that I'm putting them on the same. There was another question about everyday lies versus emotional experiences like incest. Well, of course, if you do have sex abuse or incest in your life, then you have undergone a terribly horrible emotional experience that can sometimes have some lasting effects on people. But we're dealing here with false memories of something that never happened. And so when we study the false memories of having, been a victim of a vicious animal attack when it didn't happen, or nearly drowning and having to be rescued by a lifeguard when it didn't happen, I think we are learning something about that kind of traumatic false memory.
J'ai une question, s'il vous plaît, concernant votre livre publié en 1994, Le syndrome des faux souvenirs. Vous citez au début du livre le cas de Raymond and Shirley Sousa. Et j'aimerais savoir si ces deux personnes qui avaient une soixantaine d'années à l'époque et qui avaient été condamnées par les faux souvenirs de leur petite fille ont pu être libérées en appel. Et d'une manière générale, si vos travaux ont permis à beaucoup de condamnés à tort d'être rétablis. Il n'est pas toujours possible d'avoir l'ADN ou le DNA pour prouver son innocence.
Well, I can't I can't see who's asking the question, but I understood the question completely. I do begin one of my books, which is called The Myth of Repressed Memory, with a story about the Sousas. Their saga began when the daughter goes into therapy and develops what might be considered a false claim of repressed memory. But that is not what got the Sousas, who were grandparents, prosecuted. The Sousa grown-up children then began to work on the grandchildren. And some of them started to make accusations about the grandparents, accusations that were so wild and at times even impossible. And yet the Sousas were convicted. They were sentenced to house arrest. I think they were confined to their home with ankle bracelets where they had to check in many times a day for about 7 years until they finished their sentence and were finally freed. And shortly thereafter, Ray Sousa died a natural death, and so Shirley is now living by herself. But they have not reconciled with the accusing side of the family.
Was a question there? Yeah. Là-bas, ça? Oui? Oui?
Yes.
Non, plus haut. Yeah.
Is it?
Oui, allez-y.
Yes, I'd like to know if you, in your work, have ever made any connection with the phenomenon that we call déjà vu.
Well, the phenomenon of déjà vu is really a sense of experiencing something and thinking you've experienced it before. And it's something that's not very heavily studied by psychologists. I don't really make a connection between my work and déjà vu, although it might be interesting to talk to you sometime about what kind of a connection you would make. Maybe there is something either to...
I just thought as it was a repressed memory, if you're working on that.
Yeah, and again, I just haven't linked it to déjà vu, nor have I learned anything from the little bit that I have read about the research on déjà vu that I think informs the direction of the work on repressed memories.
Yes. I would like to know if your work have already led to some modelization work into the theoretical processes of the memory.
Is the question about influencing therapy?
Yeah. My question is about the modelization of the memory process. Is the false information leading to some modelization work of the memory?
Oh, it is. I don't know the modelization. What's that? Oh, modeling.
Modeling of memory processes.
Well,
What into modeling?
Yeah, I mean, it may be that some of the computational models of memory could, accommodate the reconstructive nature of memory, and some of the parallel distributed processing models, I think, do take advantage of some of these ideas. But I don't do that kind of work, although I do think that it might be informing some of the people who do that modeling.
Okay. Monsieur?
Oui. On a très bien compris qu'il est facile d'implémenter des faux souvenirs dans la mémoire de quelqu'un. J'aurais voulu savoir s'il est possible, lorsque ces souvenirs sont implantés, de les enlever. Parce que c'est quelque chose qui dure très longtemps. Et s'il y avait des travaux qui se faisaient sur la façon de faire disparaître ces faux souvenirs, ça m'intéresserait beaucoup de le savoir.
In the experiments that we do, and in any psychological experiment, there is a phase at the end of the experiment called the debriefing phase. And that's where we tell the subjects, exactly what the experiment was about, exactly what happened to them. In a sense, we're trying to take the memory back if we have been successful in planting it. Once our subjects leave the experiment, we don't see them again. We often don't have any even records of who they are, so we can't go back to them to see what they're thinking 6 months later, unless that's part of the planned procedure in the beginning. So we certainly hope that our debriefing is getting people back to something similar to where they were before. But I can't guarantee that my subjects are not still eating lots of asparagus, for example, 6 months down the road. Now, out there in the real world, in many of these repressed memory cases, the actual cases, the thousands and thousands of questionable repressed memory cases that we had, for example, in North America before the phenomenon spread to other parts of Europe, Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the world. In the middle of this controversy, we began to see a new phenomenon, and that was individuals who were led through their psychotherapy to believe that their relatives or former neighbors or whatever had molested them, and now we're starting to realize that their memories were false. So how did that happen? As a memory scientist, I find that absolutely fascinating. And one of the ways in which this would often happen is the health insurance for the patient ran out. And so they no longer had their weekly or whatever psychotherapy that was continuing to maintain this recollection. Now, there are other ways in which people began to retract their claims, but there are now hundreds of people who once had these memories and no longer have them. And they have been studied by some researchers to try to learn a little bit more about how that happens.
I think there was a question just... Juste derrière les gens qui...
Bonjour.
Allez-y.
Pardon. Bonjour. Merci pour l'exposé très intéressant. Une question toutefois. Dans vos graphiques, nous avons pu remarquer que tout le monde n'était pas aussi sensible face à la suggestibilité et donc l'implantation des faux mémoires. Ma question c'est, est-ce que vous avez travaillé, est-ce que vous avez des recherches concernant les facteurs qui font que certaines personnes sont plus vulnérables face à la suggestibilité que d'autres? Et si ce sont des facteurs liés à la qualité de leur mémoire ou de leur personnalité? Merci.
There has been a fair amount of interest in the question of who is susceptible to having their memory be altered by this kind of contamination process. And while I believe that virtually all of us are potential subjects for having our autobiography be tampered with through suggestion, the research shows that some of us are more susceptible than others. And I'll tell you a little bit about who those extra susceptible people are. If you're somebody who tends to have lapses in memory and attention, you are more susceptible. The lapses in memory and attention are things like, do you often have the experience, you can't remember whether you did something or you just thought about doing that thing. You can't remember, did you actually do it or did you just dream about doing it? If you have that kind of experience frequently, you are more susceptible. The correlations are not great. I mean, they're on the order of, say, 0.32 or so on, statistically significant, but somewhat modest. But you are more susceptible. And now we also have some recent work with my Chinese collaborators, work that I described this morning in a different talk, that seems to show that if you score higher on standard tests of intelligence, you are more susceptible. You are less susceptible, to having your memories be tampered with in this way. The correlations there, on the order of about 0.33 or 0.35, a negative correlation indicating that greater scores on the intelligence test leads to fewer false memories. So those are just a few of the examples of the individual difference work that's been done in this area.
Okay, encore une question. Yeah, I'd be interested to know in which way your work have changed, have impacted legal affairs, and in which way maybe the protocols of the police, the way it's interrogated, has changed the way the police treat witnesses.
I do believe that there is a bit of a success story here in that the work that the people in my field do on this eyewitness testimony, memory problems, memory distortion, has had some impact on how things are done in the legal system. And so, for example, after the first big group of wrongful convictions became public and known, our government set up a committee of police, prosecutors, defense attorneys, psychologists to worry about this problem. And they produced a document called Eyewitness Evidence, A Guide to Law Enforcement, that essentially tells police and others exactly how to deal with witnesses at every stage of the process, right from the moment you end up at the scene, right after the crime or the accident occurs, all the way through the trial. And there's all kinds of information in that booklet that's based on the science. In the repressed memory area, I think we have made some headway into getting some psychotherapists to stop doing some of the things that they were previously doing that led patients to start to develop these false accusations against other people. And we've even seen some insurance companies publish warnings and notifications to the mental health professionals. If you do repressed memory therapy, you're not going to be covered for insurance purposes. So I think we are seeing some progress there in terms of the applicability of this work.
Dans le même contexte, j'aimerais savoir si vous intervenez comme expert devant les tribunaux et à quel sujet et dans quel rôle exactement.
I and many other psychologists do get involved in court cases. In my case, it would be in cases involving a memory issue of some sort. So it might be a murder case where there are eyewitnesses to some aspect of the event, and there are questions about the memory of the eyewitness. It might be a repressed memory case. For example, I was an expert witness for Gary Ramona when his daughter was accusing him based on these claims that came out of her psychotherapy. And in his lawsuit against the therapist for planting false memories. You can imagine that memory could come into play in lots of different cases, in securities fraud cases where the person who sold the security has one memory of what was promised in terms of collateral, the person buying it has a different memory. In medical malpractice cases where the doctor has one memory of the informed consent discussion and the patient has a different memory. So it really completely depends on what the specific case is, and for me, there's got to be some memory issue.
Quel est le pourcentage de votre activité? Quel est le pourcentage de votre activité qui est relié à des interventions dans des procédures judiciaires?
There was no translation of that question. Well, in my university system, the regular full-time faculty are allowed to spend 1 day a week on outside compensated consulting. And so I stay well within the requirements for my university.
Yeah, that's too bad.
Je crois que c'est une très bonne façon de terminer cette conférence en termes d'activités accessoires, qui est un sujet qui intéresse l'université. Thank you very much.